Well, thank you very much for coming along, and thank you for that very warm introduction. I really wanted to just start for about 5 minutes with some of the themes in this book you can see behind me, Rebel, and to talk about some of the ideas that I introduced in the book, and really to try and explain what the book's about. Politics in the Western world, I think we can all agree, has never been more unpredictable than it is today. I don't just mean that prime ministers call snap elections when you're least expecting it, although that certainly happened. But just take a step back and look at what's happening in Europe and America. In France, a few days ago, an extreme right-wing Front National candidate got through to the second round, and we expected it. Isn't that extraordinary? In America last year, Donald Trump, I mean, just think about that. Donald Trump not only became the candidate of the Republican Party, the party that produced Abraham Lincoln and Ronald Reagan, but it chose a developer, a New York property developer and star of The Apprentice, to become the candidate, and he then went on to win the White House. I mean, that's extraordinary. And then look at what's happening in some of those other European countries. Beppe Grillo in Italy. Geert Wilders. Look at what's happening in Holland, which was once a bastion of liberalism. I wanted to write a book that talked a little bit about this. Politics is becoming really unpredictable, and in case we think actually politics isn't predictable, we know who's going to be Prime Minister on June the 9th. Just bear two recent opinion polls that I saw in mind. In Scotland, where Theresa May and the Tory party were supposed to be extinct, there has been a 12% surge in support for the Tory party in the space of, I think, 10 days. Well, the Labour Party, which for nearly a century was the most popular party in Scotland, is barely in double digits anymore. It's been completely displaced by the rise of the SNP. Who 5 years ago would seriously have expected that to have happened? And there was another poll I looked at this morning in Wales, showing that for the first time, I think since the 1860s, the Labour Party is no longer the most popular party in Wales. There's this extraordinary turbulence and this extraordinary transformation in politics. And I wanted in the book to explain what I think is going on, why there is this volatility, why there is this mood of political insurgency. I feel that I know a little bit about it, having joined it. I left a party that has governed for pretty much decade after decade, with a few interruptions in this country, to join a party that when I joined had never won a seat in the House of Commons. And I also helped to co-found Vote Leave, which went on to get designation to run the referendum campaign and to win that. And I wanted to really share in the book my thoughts as to the causes of the political insurgency. Now, if you listen to the sort of people who produce the Today programme, if you listen to the priesthood of pundits who define the parameters of political debate in this country, they'll tell you that it's a nuisance, these new radicals. The new radicals are the problem. They'll tell you that these populists are quite ghastly, and I'll tell you one thing, there are lots of populists out there who are pretty ghastly. I can tell you that, having been in a party alongside some of them. But why do we always blame the customer? Why do we assume that if 3.8 million people vote UKIP, it's their fault? Why do we assume that if the United States of America, which used to be a bastion for change and upholding the values of equality and universal rights, has voted for a man like Trump, why don't we take a look at why it is that people vote for some of these new radical leaders, these populists, these bourgeoisists? And I think we need to ask ourselves if perhaps the problem is not the populists. The populists are a response to the emergence in most Western countries of an oligarchy. What do I mean by that? We think of ourselves as living in a democracy, and if you ask most politics students, they will tell you, of course we're more democratic than we were in the past. More people have the vote. Women have the vote. 100 years ago, you had property qualifications to vote. None of that anymore. Yes, the franchise has been extended. But I would argue that in terms of what it is that people with votes can do to influence and change public policy, politics has been subverted. It's been subverted in this country. Increasingly, public policy in this country is made by people who are immune to the views of the public. And I talk about this at some length in the book, but I will just give you a flavour of it. In the election that is coming, how many of those standing in that election, how many of those run a realistic chance of losing their seat? Most of your local MPs here have held those seats for 5, 10, 20 years. The chances of seats within a 50-mile radius here of changing hands are pretty limited. There are one or two, Slough maybe, one or two, but most MPs come from safe seats. In those seats where there is the possibility of change, look at who it is that is likely to be selected. In most cases, the people that are likely to be selected have already been working in Westminster. Literally, they will have already been working as a special advisor. I'm never quite sure what was so special about their advice, but they seem to get paid well for it. Having worked as a special advisor, they then get parachuted into a safe seat. They join a party. So long as they never fall out with their whips, they've got a job there. And if they marinate themselves in the groupthink of the party, they stand a chance of getting onto the front bench. How is that a proper functioning competitive democracy where our votes count? It isn't. If our politics is a cartel, I would say that our economy is increasingly run in the interests of a parasitic elite. What do I mean by that? I'm not anti-globalization. I actually think the criticism of globalization is profoundly misguided. Globalization has actually done a huge amount of good in allowing people to have higher standards of living. I have very little time for the Trumpists in America or the protectionists on this side of the Atlantic who talk about people stealing their jobs. I think globalization is a good thing. I also think that the criticism that there's inequality of income is simply misplaced. Look at the data. Since 2007, there has been a reduction in income inequality. And the left has cantered off in this great, giant, historic cul-de-sac, delusionally chasing something that isn't there. And they're all missing the real inequality. The inequality that is, I think, driving a lot of this unrest. It's not inequality of income. It's inequality between those who have assets, whether it's a house or a hedge fund, and those who rely on income. Because monetary policy has been run in the interests of big financial interests. Monetary policy has been run in a way that rescues bankers from the folly of their own greed and inflates the value of those with assets. And this is the fundamental driver of inequality in this country. It means that there are many people in my constituency, for another 8 days, who, if they're below the age of 40, stand zero chance of ever owning a home. Because the price that we've paid for having monetary policy run in the interests of those with assets is to basically mean that those who rely on incomes can't compete. And that is the driver. It is a profound problem, and it's not just in this country. In all of those Western states where you've had monetary policy run this way, you are seeing the rise of these new radicals. Interestingly, you don't get the rise of these new radicals to quite the same extent in places like Australia and Switzerland, where in relative terms, monetary policy has not been run in the interests of a small elite. So I talk about this in the book. And at the same time that politics has become a rigged cartel, at the same time the economy is run in the interests of an oligarchy, the expectations of the public have changed. A couple of generations ago, in the mid-20th century, people expected that they would vote for someone who would decide stuff for them. That was the basic proposition behind the left in this country. Vote for us and we'll see you right. We'll have a blueprint, a plan to provide you with healthcare or education or whatever it was, to organise the economy and society by some blueprint. In a world where people watch Netflix and they choose stuff for themselves, that is just no longer a credible proposition. And I would argue the reason why we see this schism on the left between people who've traditionally voted for left-wing parties and the left-wing elites, the reason why the blue-collar vote didn't turn out for Hillary Clinton, the reason why it's abandoned the Socialist Party in France, the reason why the Dutch Labour Party is in single figures, the reason why Comrade Corbyn is heading for a catastrophic defeat, is because the top-down Fabian proposition of vote for us and we will have a blueprint, they're just not buying it. They may, in the World of the Today programme and Westminster, still think in those terms, but out there it's just not credible. I think this change in expectations caused by digital technology is one of the reasons for this rise of anti-politics, which is why when the punditry explain the new radicalism as old-fashioned, as reactionary, as Colonel Blimp, they're fundamentally missing the point. The rise of the new radicals is not anti-modernity. It's modernity that makes it possible. It's modernity that changes expectations and democratizes opinion forming. We have parties and political institutions that haven't kept up with that change. I will sit down on a final note. In my book, it's not a book about UKIP, thank goodness. It's not even really a book about politics. It's actually a history book. And it looks back at why in some societies innovation happened, why per capita GDP grew, why some societies became incredibly creative and innovative. And I argue that it was those societies which freed themselves from parasitic elites. The norm in human history is for people to have the surplus that they produce expropriated by a small elite. In a few societies in human history, the parasites have been reined in. And when that has happened, it's been extraordinary. It happened, I argue, in the early Roman Republic. It happened in the Venetian Republic. It happened in the Dutch Republic. Note, all those three have one word in common: where power is dispersed, where they were independent entities, and when they were able to specialize and exchange and become interdependent on their neighbors. I would also argue that those three things, independence, interdependence, and dispersed power, are what underline the success of the liberal order in our age. The oligarchy that is arising today in every Western society is the primary threat to that liberal order. It's not the Le Pens and the Faragistes and the new radicals. Actually, they're playing straight into the oligarchs' hands. If you live in Greece, Tsipras and the loony left make the Troika and having Brussels write your budgets seem sensible. If Le Pen is the alternative, then voting for an enarch who pretends he's something different seems reasonable. And as we nearly discovered in the referendum a year ago, if the people saying that actually there's a better way of organising your country than having it run for you by unelected officials in Brussels stands behind posters of refugees, it almost pushes you into voting to side with Brussels. The real threat is a twin threat. It's the rise of oligarchy on one hand and illiberal populism on the other. That's not to say that we don't need populist change. It just needs to be what I would call, in the true sense of the term, liberal reform, rather than the deeply illiberalism of some of the populists and the oligarchs. Thank you.
Thank you. If you bust the oligarchies, if you smash the cartels, who comes in their place?
For many things, you don't need an elite to run things for you. It's the conceit throughout human history that you have to have a small group of people in control, otherwise the sky would fall in. Literally, in many cases, for many thousands of years, there were patrician societies in Mesopotamia, and in the Nile Valley, in Mexico, in the Indus, in China, where a small elite said literally, if you don't hand over 40% of your harvest, or 60% of your harvest, the sun will not rise the next day, or whatever it is. We get a different version of this from all elites. We're told that unless you have central bankers running your currency for you, it'll be a disaster. Well, they've been running it for us, and look what they managed to produce. A catastrophic financial meltdown and huge amounts of public debt, which need to be paid back. I recommend in the book how you could shift to systems that require small elites to control things, to systems that don't need small elites to control things. About 2,500 years ago, there was a Greek man called Epicurus, and we don't know much about him, but there was a poem written by Lucretius, who was a student of his, and he had these incredible insights. You think that people 2,500 years ago didn't understand Darwinism? Yes, they did. Read it, it's all in there. You think they didn't understand the self-ordering nature of the world? Yes, they did. This insight that the world is actually self-ordering and that order can come about emergently, organically, is a profound insight. But again and again and again, our elites, like a priesthood throughout the ages, tell us that they need to do it for us. They tell us we need a national curriculum for every child. Well, why do we need a national curriculum for every child? You can personalise what a child watches on Spotify, on Amazon TV or Netflix. Why can't you personalise a curriculum for every child? Why can't you allow teachers and parents to do that? Why do you need a minister doing that? We're told that you have to have a postcode lottery to allocate health resources. Well, why can't you have the personalisation of healthcare plans for individual families? The personalisation of public services would render redundant a political elite, so of course they don't like it. Again and again and again, from the way we manage banks, the way we manage the currency, to the way we provide public services. I would argue you don't need a patrician elite to tell us how to do things. The most innovative things in our world today are a consequence not of top-down design, but of free market, free innovation, and free ideas coming together. I'm a libertarian. I'm not an anarchist, but I am a libertarian. I don't think you need small elites to create order and structure and innovation.
For the last 12 years, you've been in the epitome of elites, sitting in Parliament. Is the party over?
Well, it is for me. I mean, I've been a member of 2 different parties and I've left them, and I'm frankly done with parties. I'm not going to join a political party again. But I think that, I say this in the book, the political cartel in this country is so appalling that we've ended up with a system by default where we're a one-party system now. I mean, that's in effect what we are. May's going to win a stonking majority because the competition has been even worse. That's the bottom line. Change is going to happen, but I don't think that the answer could possibly be provided by another party. I joined what was seen as a start-up party in the belief that it could be, but I think we're going to have to do politics differently. It's possible, I think, perhaps to do politics without a party. A party exists in order to aggregate money, votes, and communicate. All of those things you can see being done without a top-down party run in London. You could use CrowdPack, for example, to raise the funds that you need to fight elections. You could use the internet, as I did in Clacton, to communicate with voters so that even if you don't have an army of press officers in Westminster, you can still get your message across. I think this election's a bit of an exception because I think of it's the politics of Brexit, but I suspect that in 2022 you will see some very different political movements, if you like, fill the space and the vacuum that has currently been created by the existential collapse of the left.
And final one for me before I pass on to the real experts over here. Are you not the very epitome of the elites that you criticise? And thus, what right do you have to criticise this nebulous concept of elites, which I guess includes academics?
Yeah, it's a fairly, I can understand, it's a point you want to make, but I think it's a fairly bit of a cheap shot to say that I'm a member of the elite. I left a party I left a constituency where there was a 12,000 Conservative majority. I gave it up to fight a by-election for a party of political outsiders who had never won a parliamentary seat. I don't think anyone can accuse me of clinging to the inside track in politics. I think I've been prepared to sort of go outside and take a bit of a punt on things I believe in. I don't think anyone could accuse of Vote Leave of being an establishment creation. Vote Leave, when we founded it, was seems like a much unloved creation. Once we won the referendum, I've met lots of people who are keen to tell me and remind me how involved they were in its birth. I suppose success has many children and all that, but many parents and all that. But I hope you could agree that having stood for Parliament 5 times, only ever lost to Tony Blair when I stood against him as the candidate in Sedgefield, and called a by-election on a point of principle in Clacton, and
won a seat for UKIP, I hope that record would suggest that I'm prepared to actually stand on my own reputation and gamble a lot as a political outsider. But,
No, I'll take that point fully. What I would press you on, though, is define elites for me then.
I do this in the book. Obviously, if you need surgery or you get on an aeroplane, you want your doctor to be a member of the elite, the medical elite, one would hope, and you want your pilot to be an elite pilot. There's nothing wrong with being good. There's a lot to be said for being good. By elite, I'm talking about a self-referential establishment that makes public policy without little reference to the public. I give quite a detailed description of what I mean by this elite. Quangocrats might be a better term, but it doesn't really translate. The political establishment, well, everyone these days is running against the political establishment. But the difficulty in finding an easy definition doesn't mean that there isn't a phenomenon of political insiders who've carved up the political system for their own comfort and advantage.
Okay, so given your various party and independent allegiances, how would you respond to critics who call you an opportunist?
If I am an opportunist, I'm an extraordinarily inept opportunist, because I don't really think there was a great opportunity in buying shares in UKIP in 2014 when I joined them. As I said, UKIP had never won a seat in the House of Commons. I did it because I cared absolutely passionately about getting a referendum. David Cameron, having promised an in-out referendum, was procrastinating. He was watering down what he said at the Bloomberg speech. And I was prepared to lose everything in order to try to force him to give us a referendum. I don't think I was being particularly opportunist when I made the decisions I made, which put me at odds with the leadership of my new party. I did what I thought was right in order to make sure that, having got the referendum, we won it. I think if I was an opportunist, I would have spent the past 12 years recycling the party line, reading the text sent to my mobile phone, regurgitating the lines to take, and doing a stint in the Whip's office before trying to impress George Osborne. But I would, I'd rather try and achieve what I went into politics to do, which is to try and get us out of the European Union, than be the Minister for Which.
You've been called a thinking man's UKIPper in The Economist, and current leader Paul Nuttall said you were never a comfortable UKIPper. Given that you said you're not a party man, you're not a comfortable UKIPper, what was your biggest frustration with the party?
My real frustration with the party is that many of the people in the party just didn't seem to understand how to count. If you want to win an election, you have to get people who are not on your side. If you're on 10% in the polls, you've got to reach out beyond the narrow base of support. And I once went out knocking on doors with a group of kippers, and I spent most of the morning having people telling me various words off. And we retired to the pub afterwards, and several people who had been out with me told me how they hadn't spoken to a single person who wasn't on our side. And I thought, either they had been only talking to each other, or they somehow just didn't connect with the people around them. In politics, you've got to be very self-aware. You've got to see yourself how others see you. And in all parties, they do this. But in UKIP in particular, I found it very frustrating that quite often the changes that needed to be made weren't made. And again and again and again, I found that this sort of shock and awful approach of saying the most outrageous comments possible to get media headlines. Getting attention isn't much use if it's going to persuade people not to support you. Sometimes in politics, it's better to be ignored than to be the centre of attention if you're having a dig at so I found that incredibly frustrating. But it ultimately didn't matter because they didn't run the referendum campaign. If they had run the referendum campaign, it really would have mattered. But I joined UKIP because I knew, because I was aware, because I understood this tendency to sometimes put people off. I thought that if people gave the idea of leaving the European Union a fair hearing, we would win. And I thought the biggest risk to us getting that fair hearing were some of the most strident Eurosceptics, and we stopped them from dominating.
Given the referendum outcome and the most recent call for the snap election, do you have any regrets leaving the Conservative Party, or was your defection necessary for Brexit to happen?
I don't have any regrets at all leaving the Conservative Party. Having said that, I hugely admire and like lots of people in the Conservative Party. I admire and respect people in the Labour Party too. But I wouldn't go back if I was offered to go back, because in order to get David Cameron, we were nudging him all the time, putting him under pressure all the time, organising votes all the time, constant harrying, and eventually we got him to give a commitment to a referendum, and then he tried to water that down. And I think the only way to make certain that we got the referendum was to call a by-election, and mine was the first. Mark Reckless's then followed. It's very significant, I think, that about 4 weeks after I announced my by-election, David Cameron made a promise to bring forward the legislation if he was Prime Minister for a referendum within the first 100 days. And it became from that moment on a flagship Conservative Party policy. And I don't think it would have been if we weren't prepared to do that. I've got some regrets in politics, but they have absolutely nothing to do with leaving the Conservative Party or falling out with UKIP.
You've had a long parliamentary career, and you succeeded in your goal of bringing about an EU referendum and winning it.
I like winging it.
A bit of that too, I think.
But what do you see as your failures as a parliamentarian as your time in Parliament?
I mean, I think I made some mistakes as an MP. I could say this now. There have been a few times when I voted the wrong way, and I think I clearly voted the wrong way on the issue of equal marriage. I hadn't thought a great deal about it. To be honest, I wasn't that concerned about it. I had to jump one way or the other. I jumped against the legislation, and I think that was the wrong choice. And it's one of those things, within a few weeks of voting that way, I kind of knew it was the wrong thing to have done. There have been other things that I wish I had done better. There are an enormous number of schools in my part of Essex where people aged 12 and 13 and 14 need someone to come along and inspire them and give them a sense that they could come to a university like Reading University and that there's a whole world of opportunity out there. And every couple of years I would try and go to the schools and try and say, can we do more to get that sense of aspiration? And I wish I had done more to push that, because I think it's outrageous that there are so many schools in this country and in my part of Essex where, frankly, young children at that age are not given to understand that there are the opportunities that you have. And I think that's criminal. And I could have done more to push that. Too often there's a sense of mediocrity and a sense of we're ticking the boxes, but I think it requires inspirational teachers to go in and say, actually, you could really make something special of your life, and one way to do it would be to come to a university.
You're not yet 46. You're a young man to be giving up this game. What do? You're going to be unemployed next week. Middle-aged, white male, unemployed. You're going to be a statistic. What do you do?
Well, for a start, look at the bright side. I'm no longer parasiting off the public purse. That's a good thing. If you're a libertarian, you should be comfortable with that. Before I worked in politics, the best job I ever had was working in TV in my early 20s in Rome. I had a wonderful time. And I then went from that to working in fund management in the city and for the continental European division of a FTSE 100 fund management company. I've got a million and one ideas of things I want to do. And quite often over the past 12 years, I've thought to myself, if I could live a series of parallel lives, I know exactly what else I would be doing. There's so much opportunity, so many things out there completely unrelated to politics. And from May the 3rd, I can do that. I'm not going to share those ideas with you because in a weird way, I'm stepping out of public life. But I'm not, I'm spending the next couple of weeks pottering around my vegetable patch, weather allowing. But I'm looking forward to going off and doing something completely different.
There's a couple of other people who might be doing something completely different. If I said Nigel Farage and Aaron Banks, one thing they've said they're not doing is either of them running for the Clacton seat. Do you know where the bodies are buried?
I've ignored some of those people, and I've found it quite easy to ignore one of them or two of those people. And I suspect that Clacton was poised to ignore them too, and I suspect that's maybe why they're not could be why they're not running. But that's just my view. I think one of the reasons why many people in UKIP are no longer running is because they've finally learned at the end of their political careers what you should learn at the beginning, which is how to count. The maths on the wall are pretty bleak for UKIP. And I would say that's because job done. We've won the argument, and we should give ourselves a pat on the back and go back to the other mainstream options.
Right. Can I just say to the audience here, 2-minute warning, you're about to get your chance. I'm going to have one more question from each of these guys. I'm going to pick up on one thing. You say, job done, you've won the argument. You won the vote, but do you really believe you've won the argument?
Absolutely. I listened to Keir Starmer today, and I listened to him talking about how Labour is going to respond. And what was striking is the extent to which the Labour Party is coming around to the Vote Leave script. He talked about maintaining the Erasmus scheme, straight out of the Vote Leave playbook, about Horizon 2020 continuing. He talked about, and even used some of the terminology that was considered radical and off the wall 12 months ago and unthinkable when we were thinking about it for the first time a decade ago. You're going to find, in any referendum, when you get a fierce polarisation of debate, people on either side of the argument are going to think the worst of their opponents. But the reality is that leaving the European Union does not mean pursuing a Nigel Farage type policy of Brexit. It does not mean closing the borders. It does not mean little Englanderism. And I think as people come to realise that, actually Brexit is the start of a quite liberal transformation, I think there are people to be won over and won around. I don't want to spend the next 20 years banging on about Europe the way I spent the last 20 years banging on about it. The way to do it is to understand their good, decent, legitimate points of view on the Remain side. We need to listen to those, we need to take those points on board. For example, free movement of people is coming to an end. But there's nothing to stop us having the free movement of workers. There's nothing to stop people offering people jobs from other European countries. You can do that. And I think when people realise that actually Brexit is not the bogeyman that they perhaps thought it was, I think that the 52-48 will become a 60-40. How many people today think we should join the euro? When it was a hot topic 20 years ago, there were a sizable number of people, particularly amongst the so-called intelligentsia, saying we should join. And they felt very strongly about it, and they felt very bitter when we didn't join. But few people seriously today believe that we should join the euro. And it's the same with leaving the EU. The question, though, is what kind of country do we become? And that's what's so exciting. If you believe we need higher environmental standards, as I do, I joined Friends of the Earth before I ever joined a political party, or if you believe, because you're a socialist, that we need to micromanage people's lives, good luck with that, but go ahead. Or, if you're on the libertarian right and you want to remove regulation, now's your opportunity. We can shape the future of our country. I don't think we should be fearful of this. If your arguments are good, they can be won amongst the electorate. We don't need unelected officials to create the kind of Britain that we want to see. It's up for us to do it. I voted for Brexit because I want to change this country. I don't like the status quo. I certainly don't want this country to go backwards. I want far-reaching and radical reform. I want a localist revolution. I don't want to bring powers back from Brussels and leave them smouldering in Whitehall for people like Nicholas Soames to get their hands on. I want to pass them outward and downward. We can do this now. If you don't like the shape of Britain today, this is your chance to change it profoundly.
Should we take one last question from you guys?
Your question. Last question.
Yeah, okay, so I want to circle back before we move on to the beginning of where all of this came from. And I want to know, how did growing up in Uganda affect the political ideology that you have today?
I'll be honest, I didn't spend a great deal of my wonderful, idyllic childhood thinking a great deal about politics. It was a wonderful place to grow up. It was the most extraordinary. I mean, in terms of climate, think of the most perfect June afternoon every day. It's a wonderful place. I do think perhaps growing up outside the country perhaps gives me an appreciation. You know, there's that famous line of poetry, what do they know of England who only England know? Perhaps you get a better appreciation of what's so special about a country if you've had some experience. I don't know if you've maybe travelled abroad or spent a gap year somewhere. You come back and things you took for granted you realise aren't universal. And I've often wondered why some countries are a success and some aren't. Uganda ought to be, if you look at the geography and the geology and the environment, incredibly successful in it. It wasn't always, particularly when I was growing up there. And yet here we are on a soggy little island where it rains more than it should, and they have 4 seasons in the space of a day. And look at what this country's achieved. It's extraordinary innovation and influence upon the world. I would argue that that's nothing to do with the climate or the water. It's to do with the fact that power is dispersed and you have interdependence and specialisation and exchange and free exchange. I think also maybe growing up in a different country, it's made me realise just quite what an extraordinary country this is. You know, at some points over the past few years, I've heard people getting very, very worked up about things. You know, there was a time when the Supreme Court had made a decision on the Gina Miller case, and there were people talking about 100,000 people marching on the Supreme Court. No, I don't want this country to be like that. We're not that sort of country. We're not the sort of country where people who have differences of opinion feel they have to march and intimidate. This is ultimately a country where, you know, our ministers should travel to work on the tube, and people should have fierce differences of opinion, but ultimately have a bit of respect. You know, we're all going to have to get along, and however Brexit works out, we're going to have to find a way of settling this that means that all but the most strident Remainers can live with it.
I think it is ample time we've had on the floor here, so it's time to go to the floor. So I'm going to stand up, which is the only time I will ever be taller than Douglas. But I can see all of you guys there. So, can you wait for the microphone to come to you? It is going to come to you first, Adam. There. So, Felix, if you want to come around to Adam here, we will start with the first question. As I said before in the introduction, let's just keep it civil. Keep it tough, but keep it civil.
Thank you for giving up your time to be here, Douglas. I greatly admired your campaign throughout your parliamentary career. I just wanted to know more about why don't you get along with people like Aaron Banks, Raheem Kassam, the so-called bad boys of Brexit, the people that you said were going to organise that march on the Supreme Court?
I try hard to get on with people, and you know, if you join a new political party, it's generally a good idea to try and get on with people. But I have a real problem, for example, with those Syria posters. I have a real issue with that because, you know, there are people, whether we like it or not, who have to up sticks and leave their country and seek refuge in other countries, and I think most reasonable people would accept that, and I just think I disagree with that. I found the comments that Nigel made during the run-up to general election on immigration and HIV just slightly distasteful. And you know, there comes a point where, you know, we all have differences of opinion, but my differences of opinion with them were, you know, I think more than just on ad hoc issues. It's a fundamental difference of approach. I think that you don't win and persuade people by sounding angry. And ultimately, I'm an optimist. I think this country is better now than it was 20, 30 years ago. It's more tolerant. It's more. It's technologically better off. It's more exciting. I think most of the world is getting better. There's still war and tragedy around the world, but the country I grew up in is vastly better off than it was when I was growing up there. The world is getting better. Ultimately, I think some of those people that I didn't always see eye to eye have a sort of Britain's gone to the dogs nativism. And Britain hasn't gone to the dogs. There's a lot wrong with the country, but actually it's a lot better than it was. And gone to the dogs nativism is just not, it's just not true. And I think that's the root cause of the problem. Also, if you're on Twitter and you're making angry noises on Twitter, you think that everyone else shares your views, but that's called your timeline, and not your timeline. The electorate isn't all on your timeline, and I'm not sure that everyone's quite learnt that yet, but don't tell them.
For those people who are interested in Twitter, hashtag UORRebel, get on it now, good place to be. Maybe an echo chamber, who knows. I have some questions that have come in via social media. We are almost in the 21st century here. One that kind of relates to the last one. How can young liberal Remainer students find confidence or peace? And the questioner here has said, in what looks like a bleak future. I'm sure it doesn't seem so bleak to you, but how do you bring those people on board?
Well, I would say in the nicest possible way that if you are a true liberal, I struggle to ask yourself, I struggle to see how you could be happy with living in a political arrangement where a small unelected group of officials try and organise the lives of tens of millions of Europeans by fiat and design. The European Union is about creating blueprints for the currency, a monetary union, blueprints for trade, regulation, blueprints for everything. Why is it considered liberal to be in favour of that? The word liberalism comes from Latin, liber, meaning free. A liberal was someone who understood that the world was self-organising. It didn't require a priesthood or an elite or, heaven forbid, literally a divine being to orchestrate and organise. So in that question, I think, is the problem for the liberal Remainers. The reason why the European Union is a failing project is because it is a project of an elite to organise the affairs of Europe by design, and that is a disaster. The reason why Europe became a success story from the 14th century onwards was precisely because, unlike China or India or the Ottoman Empire, there was no elite at the top. There was no group, as they had in China, of mandarins. But there are mandarins today in Brussels, and they're driving Europe into the ground. Escaping from that, I think, actually preserves the liberal order. If you doubt me, just look at the difference between France and the United Kingdom. In liberal Euroland, there's a serious chance they may have a woman president in a week's time, Marine Le Pen. In Britain, we have preserved the liberal order by leaving the European Union. We're about to elect a vicar's daughter from Maidenhead with a landslide majority. Maybe Brexit is actually the safety valve. Maybe Brexit is what preserves the liberal order. Maybe Trump, Le Pen, Grillo are what you end up with if you don't have a safety valve. I think actually Brexit frees us from those illiberal forces that are enveloping the rest of Europe.
Thank you. Take some more questions. Lady here in the middle.
Having said a lot about you see this better future, and having let the genie out of the bottle, how do you justify now walking away and not being part of shaping that future?
I take it from your comment that you may not be entirely signed up to vote leave, and you may have a regret at the way that the majority of people voted. I consistently said I wanted us to leave the European Union. And I think that by voting to leave, we will grow faster economically. All the Project Fear forecasts have proved to be false, and the chief architect of them is going to be spending more time with his newspaper. small group of central bankers who warned it would be doom and gloom if we voted to leave. I think we can say they got it wrong. Our economy has done pretty well. I think it will do even better as we begin to make sure that public policy is suited to the conditions of our economy and not to a generic concept of Europe as a whole. The countries and the continents that are growing tend to be those outside Europe. Europe is the slowest growing continent in the world, save the Antarctic. I think that means that we can, by having trade relations with the rest of the world, ensure that we benefit from trading with the countries where the growth is. In Uganda, they think they've had a terrible year economically because growth is down to 5%. Imagine if we could trade freely and openly with the whole world. So I think economically we will do better. I think democratically we will do better. They may not have quite cottoned on to this yet, but actually, if you're a member of the Green Party, you could write one heck of a manifesto about the change that I think we need to preserve the environment. As societies get richer, firstly, they tend to spend more on healthcare, then they tend to spend more on education. Thirdly, I think we're seeing people tend to want to spend more on environmental protection. There's a huge agenda out there to raise environmental standards. Being in the European Union means that the maximum standards have become the minimum standards. I don't think that's good enough. I would like us to have higher levels of environmental protection. We can do that. If you're on the left and you believe that actually we should have more social protection, well, I suspect that actually a 3-day weekend is not that far away. There's a huge agenda there for the left if they want to improve working conditions. But they're not doing any of that. Why? Because for so many years they've left it to a small unelected elite across the channel to give them the sorts of education or environmental or employment policy that they wanted. When they wake up and realise that actually they can go even better, then I think you will see a huge vitality in democracy in this country. Personally, I think job done. But if like me, you don't want to leave it to the patrician Tories, get stuck in.
Hands in the air, please. Right. I will come to Max, I will come to Kieran, I will come to Ed, but I want to come to, I was going to say the lady with the glasses in the middle. Woman with the glasses, there are two of you. Let's go for the lady with the scarf.
Hello. I'd like to pick up on a point you made about the national curriculum, which I found very interesting indeed. Why I want to pick up on that is before the referendum was happening, I heard a lot of rhetoric, some from UKIP, some from other people, that was, in my opinion, very pro-colonial. I heard some language about the glorification of the British Empire, for example, and I found this deeply worrying. And I think one of the things we should be doing in schools is actually teaching young British people about the empire properly, about the atrocities that happened there at the time. And I was wondering what your opinions were on this, particularly someone that grew up in Uganda, which of course we know the catastrophes that happened there, and also as a former British Empire as well. And I want to bring up the announcement yesterday about the fail, and I wonder what your opinions were on it. And talking back about colonial discourse, is this simply, as Vivek says, who is Indian and was of course in Britain was in India during the British Empire, is this just white men saving brown women from brown men?
If you're a proper liberal, you should be against the empire, and if you're a proper liberal at the time of Gladstone, when he was outmanoeuvred by Disraeli, you would have been against the acquisition of empire. In the book that I've written, I talk about the republics of Rome and of Venice and of the Netherlands. And in all three cases, one of the reasons why it went so catastrophically wrong for those republics is precisely because they acquired provincial empires to extort. Rome acquired Sicily and then Pergamon. Venice acquired an empire to the east. The Netherlands acquired the Spice Islands. That sudden inflow of wealth meant the creation of an oligarchy, and the republics came to an end, and it was a disaster. Britain very nearly befell that same fate. We, like the Dutch, acquired an empire. They had the VOC, an extortive, exploitative machine. We had the East India Company. An extraordinary thing, though, is that we saved ourselves from the worst excesses of that because of liberalism in the 19th century. The so-called old corruption was dealt with. The franchise was extended. The Dutch went for a system of patronage. We ended up with the Northcote Rebellion reforms. The extraordinary thing was the ability of this country to avoid that fate. And so if you're talking about the history of imperialism and colonialism and British colonialism, you should, if you're a proper liberal, be against it. But I think you should also recognise the extraordinary role this country has had as a great power in bringing the liberal order. It was this country that began to have coaling stations in West Africa precisely because it wanted to stop the slave trade. You talked about Uganda being a colony. It never was. It was a protectorate. Why? Because the British government was lobbied by philanthropic organisations to acquire it to keep out slavers. So I think we've got to understand that, yes, there's a lot wrong with imperialism in the past, but to see it purely through the prism of the politically correct left today is to commit the same fault that the Colonel Blimps on the right used to do, to see it as flawless. You talked about, your question originally was in the context of a curriculum. I would argue that actually it's not just schools, it's universities too. There is a profound problem in this country, and that is because often we teach people what to think. We need to teach them how to think. Giving people a narrative of the past as the correct narrative tells us more about our preconceptions than it does about what happened before us. A truly liberal mind and a truly educated historian would be able to understand opinions, hold in their mind those opinions without necessarily agreeing with them. And too often that doesn't happen in academia, and that, I think, is the root cause of many of the problems we see.
Thank you. I asked this question briefly as a post-colonial scholar myself.
Actually, we've got quite a lot of people wanting to ask questions, so we're going to have to stick it to one.
I just want to say quickly that in my opinion, colonialism is just a form of invading someone's country. For example, how is that different from going into someone's house and raping someone's wife and stealing from them? In my opinion, colonialism is wrong. It's invading someone's country. And building some pretty buildings, giving people the vote and some nice roads isn't enough to make up for that.
Thank you. Point made and well made. Haven't had many questions from the back. I see a couple of hands going up. Chris Timms up there, who's never short of a question.
Just a quick question for me. Why did you veto Nigel Farage's knighthood?
Get off the fence, Chris.
I think it would be, I'm not going to say much, I deny vetoing anyone's knighthood.
Short question, short answer. I like short questions. We can go slightly longer. Let's go to near the front here as well. The blonde lady who I almost cut off in her prime before.
Hi, thank you. Short question here as well. May I ask you, why are you a racist and why have you been hating EU citizens so much? And how do you feel that you are one of the
ideological initiators of so many assaults towards EU citizens since the referendum? Thank you.
I will respond
Do
that.
you even sleep at nights?
I will respond to that question with the good grace with which it was asked and say, I spent most of my working life before I went into politics living and working in Europe. First in Rome and then in Frankfurt and Brussels. I think it's quite extraordinary to categorise those of us who want self-government as somehow extreme. Switzerland is a self-governing republic. Canada's self-governing, New Zealand's self-governing. In fact, most of the 190 odd countries around the world are self-governing. Why is it considered extreme to want to elect your representatives in your legislature to make your public policy in a way that's accountable to you? I think what breeds extremism is when you deny people that legitimate democratic self-determination, and then you start to see this kind of forces that we start to see unleashed in France. And I think that is the real danger. If you deny people democratic self-determination, as the Habsburg elites denied democratic self-determination in East and Central Europe, you get some pretty horrific results. So, I argue that actually we're the antithesis of narrow-minded, xenophobic racism. And I think as the unhappy consequences of the Brussels project become more obvious, that argument will become more apparent.
We absolutely support free speech and the right for people to ask questions and have them answered. I think it worked in both respects there. So let's keep in that vein. Ed, at the front.
So it's really a two-part question. Obviously you spoke about the fact that you thought party politics always has failed or is failing us, and sort of a way to go forward is to look at potentially independent candidates running more often. So firstly, is that realistic? And secondly, if it isn't, do you see something like a proportional representation system, maybe like Scotland in the Scottish elections has, as being a better option than what we have today?
We certainly don't want pure PR. Look at the Dutch system. I suddenly became an expert, like many people on Dutch politics, with the Dutch election, but I was horrified to discuss that it's 100% proportional. And it's a nightmare because it means, it really does encourage the worst sort of people to get attention, to get a slither of the vote, and you shouldn't have pure PR, but we do need change. And I would argue that the change we need is fairly straightforward. We tend to think of the one-party, one-member seat system as old as the Constitution. And in a weird way it is, because most of our constitutions are late Victorian invention in many ways. So we never had this system until the year they gave the working man the vote. The year they gave the working man the vote, in 1882, was it? 1882? In 1882, when they gave the working man the vote, they created a monopolistic system so that it was one MP per seat, so that they could control who it was the working man voted for. Before then, you had 2, sometimes 3, occasionally 4 MPs per constituency. I would like us to go back to that. The Irish have it. STV is the clumsy way of calling it, but if I was appealing to a traditional audience, I would call it the traditional system we had, or call it what you like, multi-member seats. If you had 2 or 3 MPs per constituency, it would be more proportional, but not hideously proportional like the Dutch system. It would mean that even if you live in a rock-solidly Labour or rock-solidly Tory area, you would still have choice and competition over who got to represent you. I know MPs who, through the entire 12 years that I was a Member of Parliament, never had a surgery. I know some MPs who are completely immune to the views of their electorate because they've got a 20,000 majority, and so long as they never fall out with their whips, they've got a job for life. If you had 2 or 3 MPs per constituency, incidentally by reducing the number of constituents, not doubling the number of MPs, if you had multi-member seats, I think you would get that choice and competition. And I think it's vital that we actually do that. Another reason why I don't want a pure PR system is because I actually think there's a lot to be said for having grit in the oyster, but you don't want a system that encourages the worst instincts in some politicians to come to the fore. And actually our system should allow dissent, but it shouldn't allow loudmouths and charlatans to get a pedestal.
Is that not still dominated by a few major parties though? Would that system not still be dominated by
I would love a system where you had, number one, open primary candidate selection.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't force parties to do it, but I would create a vehicle so that they had to do it. Open primary candidate selection is the key. Incidentally, Trump got in because there were closed primaries and you had to be a registered Republican to vote in them. In the states where you had open primaries, they tended to vote for more moderate candidates. So open primary candidate selection, I think, is key. I also think a right of recall. If you introduce both of those things, at the moment you can go into, in this room we have our disagreements. You'll always have disagreements. In parties you will have a couple of hundred MPs in a room and they'll all pretend they agree on everything. It's a nonsense way of trying to run a country. If you had a system that actually allowed MPs within parties to disagree and have honest disagreements and vote against their party, you would have a healthy democracy, and the only way you can achieve that is to have a right of recall, so MPs would have to take into account what voters thought, and a system of open primary candidate selection, and possibly multi-member seats.
I'm going to go online for the next question and take you back to loudmouthed charlatans with a question from Tim, who's probably not a loudmouthed charlatan, but he asks what your view is of Paul Nuttall and him locking himself away in a room to not have to give a decision on whether he's going to be standing in the election.
Interestingly, one of the great things about leaving UKIP is it's not my problem. I don't have to have a view on it, and I'm not going to. There's a lot to be said for locking yourself away in a room. Perhaps it should be a darkened room in the case of one or two people in politics, but I'm not going to say unkind things. On the issue of, and this one thing I didn't ask earlier was the burqa ban. Someone asked me about. You should never, I think, in this country, require people to dress or not dress a certain way. There's a wonderful Aesop's fable where the sun and the wind are trying to get a man to take off his coat. And the sun says, the wind says he'll try and do it by billowing the man and buffeting him and forcing him to take off his coat. And he doesn't take off his coat. The sun comes out and warms him up and he feels comfortable and he chooses to take off his coat. If you want people to integrate, you've got to do it, you've got to make them want to do it. And the idea of doing it by top-down fiat, like they've tried in France, it's been a disaster in France. Banning veils is not the way forward. If you want people to feel comfortable with our contemporary cultural reference points, you do it by making them want to be part of it, not by stake fiat.
Excellent. Again, I'm going to go to the back of the room and then come down to the front. So, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but I am pointing at you, and Felix is heading your way.
Thank you. You've articulated your views on libertarianism like in a very persuasive way. As a free marketeer economist in the Austrian school, what I believe in, I would subscribe to that a lot. But my question is, would you have any faith and confidence that Theresa May and the Conservative Party would actually make those changes after the election?
It's good to meet an Austrian. I'm an absolute von Mises disciple. And the book is very much trying to propose Austrian ideas about restraining the worst excess of fractional reserve banking, of dealing with the candy floss credit situation. There, getting rid of the state control of money. There are practical solutions to this. I hope you'll find in the book. The short answer is no. The Tory party is a patrician vehicle for self-aggrandizement in the case of most MPs, and they're not even aware of the problem. They think that cheap credit has made us rich. The Tory party has throughout history been forced to do the right thing. On appeasement, they were completely wrong on the issue of appeasement until Brendan Bracken and one or two others forced them to pivot in the late 1930s. On the issue of monetarism versus Keynesianism in the 1970s, the Tory party under Heath was even worse than the Labour government. And yet, they would have us believe that they discovered monetarism, even though we all know it was the IMF who forced the Labour Party to do it, and the Labour Party, in its last days in office, was monetarist. On the Europe question, the Tory party has been forced to pivot and do the right thing. Forced to, when the thumbscrews are on. And they've now effortlessly pivoted to read the Eurosceptic script and are delivering it beautifully. They're going to have to be forced, I think, on the issue of bank reform. There is going to be, I think, a huge day of reckoning, and I don't think we're a million miles away from that. None of the things that were supposed to be resolved in 2007 have been resolved. I argue in my book that the problem started in 1971 with the Nixon reforms for the dollar, the post-Bretton Woods monetary system. You cannot have 100% fiat currency and unrestricted fractional reserve banking forever. We've managed to do in a period of 40 years what the Roman authorities did in 200. We've debased the currency and we've caused this catastrophic problem of malinvestment. It's going to come home to roost. Someone will have to pivot at some point. I toyed with the idea of staying on in politics, working with Steve Baker and a handful of other people who get this and trying to do something about it. But I suspect the Italian and Japanese bond market might force them to pivot even sooner than that. That moment will come. 2 + 2 can only ever equal 4. We live with a government that still believes it can equal 6 or 7.
That's not the Libertarian Party then in that case.
Where do Liberals go? Where do Liberals go? This is an intriguing question. The liberal order is what underlines the success of our world. And yet, if you're a proper liberal, who do you vote for? All parties suffer from what I call the big man myth. It usually is a man, sometimes it's a woman. The big man myth. If you vote for this one individual, Theresa May, it was Tony Blair, Barack Obama, now it's Donald Trump, heaven help us. They're somehow going to fix everything. That's the root cause of the problem. The world doesn't work like that. No one individual has the power to reach their hand into every social and economic problem and fix it. And that's the root cause of our problem. So who does a Liberal vote for? That's the question I'm trying to address in the book.
Thank you.
Right, more questions. We've got about 10 minutes, so I will try and get to all of you. I have to give a fellow member of the Politics and International Relations staff a crack at this. So, question from Graham.
Afternoon, Douglas. Thank you for coming in and speaking today. I found you to be a very articulate individual and very competent speaker when it came to the Brexit vote. I also find you to be a very good political analyst as well. So I'm Northern myself. I grew up very much attached to the Labour Party. I just wondered if I could push you on the question of where you see Labour today. From my own experiences, virtually everyone I knew from home moved across to vote for UKIP last time and vote for Brexit. Seems like virtually everyone is going to vote for Conservatives now and abandon the Labour Party. And I was wondering if you see where you see Labour now and maybe in the next 5 years. Are they really facing an existential threat, in your opinion?
Everyone's looking at this election in terms of Brexit, and rightly so, it's hugely important, but they're missing the really big picture. And the really big picture is the same phenomenon that explains why blue-collar voters didn't turn up for Hillary in Pennsylvania, why the traditional union vote in France has abandoned the Socialist Party. This is a phenomenon happening throughout the world. And they're not dealing with Brexit in those countries, so it's much bigger than Brexit. Fundamentally, the proposition from the left has always been that they have a blueprint of some kind. And we now live in a world where it's just not credible or desirable for people to have their lives organised that way. We run our health service and our education system based on ideas that were inherited from a system of World War II rationing. The idea that, if you live in a particular catchment area, you go to a particular school. If we ran supermarkets that way, there'd be catchment areas for breakfast cereals and waiting lists for bananas. There were at one time. You can't run the world that way anymore. And this is an existential crisis for the left. Another crisis for the left is that if you talk about equality amongst the Labour elites, they mean sameness of outcome. If you talk about equality amongst the blue-collar traditional Labour voters in towns like Clacton, they see fairness as getting out of it what you put into it. In other words, those two ideas are coming apart because the left elite still believes in top-down, one-size-fits-all provision, and yet the traditional left vote is up for the idea of the personalisation, the hyper-personalisation of public services. And I can't see any traditional leftist majority in this country ever again. I think it's a technology-driven, it's a zeitgeist-driven change. What I do think is that you will see something else come into that space. An SDP type creation, probably a creation of the demos rather than the elites. The SDP was formed by 4 Labour MPs who faced deselection from their equivalent of Momentum. And it will, number one, accept the free market. It will, number two, accept that we don't have a free market today. It'll be pro-capitalism, but it'll respect the fact that actually the system of capitalism we have today is a fraud. If we had a capitalist system today, capital would be allocated by the pricing mechanism. It's not. It's handed out by central bankers to their central bankers' mates. So it would be pro-free market, pro-capitalist, properly liberal, and in being so actually very, very subversive and hostile to the vested interests that preside over this country. Liberalism ought to be a very subversive creed. There's a huge scope for a proper liberal party. Perhaps what we're seeing is really the reverse of what happened in the 1920s. In the 1920s, the old Liberal Party, which abandoned any pretense at true liberalism in the 1986 budget, was then superseded by a socialist stroke Fabian party. I think we're seeing that process reversing and unwinding. I'm not sure what comes next, but if you're not a patrician Tory, I'm not a patrician Tory. I'm voting Tory in this election because I want Brexit to be done and dusted and sorted out, and I'd rather have Theresa May do it than some of the others. But I want an alternative so that I can vote for someone that's sensible and credible and doesn't think that the way to get me to support them is to promise to organise my life like it's 1960 something.
Probably got time for a couple more. There's an awful lot of blokes' hairy arms going up in the air here. That would be nice to be a bit more varied, but talking of a bloke's hairy arm, Kieran, you have a question.
My arms are not hairy, just before I ask my question. Earlier on, I'm afraid I've forgotten the context. You mentioned Europe and changes and improvements from, I think it was the 14th century. And clearly you know much more about history than probably most of us do in this room, certainly much more than me. I'm just curious as to what you mean by improvements in Europe from the 14th century.
The ideas aren't really mine. There was a book written by Professor Jones from Australia called The European Miracle. If you haven't read it, do read it. It's fascinating. Those ideas were taken up by Paul Kennedy, who taught at UEA where I went to university, and I won't pretend that the arguments I make in my book are original. He asked the question of why was it that Europe took off in terms of the growth in per capita, GDP per capita, in terms of innovation and inventiveness. And it's true, if you had been a Martian looking at planet Earth in the year 1400, and you look down, the most advanced civilization by far would have been China. You would have looked at what was happening in the Indus Valley. You would have looked at the remnants of Byzantium as far more promising than what you had in Europe, where you had a few hovels and a few castles in forest clearings. And yet, for the next 4 centuries, who dominates? Now, if you believe that sort of the template off-the-shelf Marxian drivel is because they exploited the rest of the world, it puts the cart before the horse there. The whole point about Holland is that there was economic takeoff, which allowed that innovation, which then allowed Holland to claim parts of the world for its own. That process of European takeoff actually, quite interestingly, stalled several times. Northern Italy was very, very close to having a textile revolution. In fact, it had the water wheel and it had a lot of workers in Lucca and Milan. 300-400 years before Arkwright got the same idea in England. So you have this innovation in Europe, and he argues that it's because you don't have political centralization. You have a mosaic of competing statelets. And he argues quite convincingly that in China and the Ottoman Empire in particular, a small elite inhibits innovation. And he gives examples. The Chinese were leading the world in navigation, invented the magnetic compass, the bigger sailing ships, and then Imperial Egypt bans the construction of ships with more than 3 masts. So instead of China discovering Portugal, which they're on the verge of doing, Portugal ends up discovering China. The printing press, a Chinese innovation, it was only allowed to be used for printing official documents, so they never cottoned on to the idea of printable typeface. Again and again and again, you see regulation. And I talk in the book in quite a lot of detail about the way in which Chinese society was regulated by elites. Not having elites running Europe from the top down was absolutely vital to its takeoff. And I elaborate quite length. I recommend you read the book.
Copies will be on sale outside the room after the event. And other politics books are out there too. A last question from the floor. There's a few hands gone up. Max, you've had your hand up a lot, so go for it for the last one. I apologise to the rest of you, but you will have the opportunity to talk to Douglas outside when he will be signing copies of his book.
I also wanted to just say thank you for coming to talk. I saw you when you came back to your old secondary school about 5 years ago, so it's interesting to see how things have progressed since then. I want to know, as someone who's been such a successful backbench MP, what do you think are the most important skills that a backbencher should have in terms of getting their agenda through and making sure the government hears what they want to hear?
That's kind of me, thank you. I think quite a thick skin is, if you stand outside the groupthink in Westminster, you will get not so much other MPs, but you will get the commentariat, particularly the broadcast journalists, really, unthinkingly hostile to you. Why? They'll justify it as making good telly, and you've got to be quite prepared to go into TV studios and never actually being asked what they told you they wanted to talk to you about. So you've got to have quite a thick skin. And I think digital has actually allowed me to do all the things I've done. And I think if I had been in politics 20 years earlier, I never would have managed to I never would have been able to table a motion that successfully ousted the Speaker. I don't think we would have ever been able to get 111 MPs to go for that key vote that forced Cameron to concede a referendum. I certainly wouldn't have been able to win the Clacton by-election because I couldn't have on my laptop the data that the big parties had. I wouldn't have been able to hold my seat for a similar reason. Digital has democratised politics. It's created a much more level playing field if you've got the know-how. And I think I shudder to think how many other MPs there must have been in the House of Commons over the years who were brimming with ideas, but because there was no digital outlet, they couldn't even blog about what they were thinking. The only outlet for their ideas would have been if they were in with the in-crowd who wrote newspapers or edited the Today programme. And I suspect there have been lots and lots of MPs who've been completely unable to change things. I was very, very lucky to be in Parliament just as digital was coming in. I had a blog site, and it's slightly gone out. Blogs have slightly gone out of fashion now, but at one time I was getting 20,000 people a week reading it. I could, and I still can, use Twitter to try to make sure that I get cut through into mainstream media on particular days if I want to say something. So I think being very savvy with digital and understanding how communication works. I mean, I made a video on Facebook that was watched by 1.4 million people. Being able to do that, I think, is key. So I think if you do want to go into politics and be a backbencher, I would definitely do a lot of stuff on social media. But don't say foolish things, because they can dig it up in 10 years' time. And do you know one of the things I'm looking forward to is being able to tweet stuff and not thinking, am I going to lose votes for this?
You're not going to lose votes, but I'm going to close by projecting you forward into the future. It's April the 25th, 2027. We've been through Brexit, we've emerged the other side in whatever it looks like. What does it look like for you? What is the Britain that all of these guys will be key figures within in 10 years' time?
I hope that we have once we've left, I hope that we have the sort of growth in GDP that countries like Singapore have had. I hope that we continue to have this great feeling that London and the southeast of England is this great global crossroads where the world meets. I hope that the idea of being a self-governing country and it being possible to manage your own affairs and make a success of it is considered so normal. Even those people who voted the other way have gently rewritten their memories to remember that they were in favour of a liberal Brexit and a liberal Britain all along.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. I'd like you to join me, first of all, to thank Fiona and Jack for their work on tonight's event, also Holly and Felix for getting involved, but most of all for our special guest tonight, Douglas Carswell MP.